Culture has always adapted to its contemporary realities via new mediums and real-world dynamics. They have, in brief, always sustained themselves. Welcome to Sustainability Matters, where today we explore how culture, history, and place come together in the 21st century in the context of Jewish Europe. But before we get into that, on the matter of sustainability, we're also excited to announce the publication of Gruyter Brill's first annual Impact Report. This report will give you some key insights into our broader sustainability efforts as a publisher and the progress we've made in 2025. Check out the link in the show notes to see how we're turning sustainability commitments into action. Jewish Europe is explored through the new edited volume, Virtual and Real-Life Spaces of Jewish Europe in the 21st Century, published by Gruyter Brill. Edited by Drs. Maja Hultman and Joachim Schlör, this book incorporates leading voices in heritage studies, anthropology, history, and cultural studies, exploring how Jewish spaces, both physical and digital, have evolved. From virtual reconstructions of lost synagogues and nostalgia networks connecting American Jews to their European roots, to living heritage sites like the medieval Speierwurms and Mainz communities and restored cemeteries, the book chapters discuss how memory, identity, and community may thrive together in virtual and real spaces. Today, we get a glimpse into this book. I'm your host for the episode, Dr. Sean Noland, and I'm an anthropologist and historian. I have some Jewish heritage myself, and I'm keenly interested in material culture, museums, and other heterotopias and urban mythology. On the idea of heritage, in this episode, we'll unpack what virtual Jewish spaces mean today and why these ideas have an impact beyond their community context. These virtual Jewish spaces raise urgent questions of sustainability, cultural and environmental. Virtual spaces may allow communities to gather, learn, and transmit heritage without physical travel and venues, and they may offer a model for keeping Jewish culture resilient for generations to come. Drs. Hultman and Schlör, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So I'd like to start with the questions. May 2022, you co-hosted a conference as COVID lockdowns were coming to a close, which ultimately led to this book. Throughout the book, a red thread is referred to as a backdrop to more recent times and as perhaps formative for this final published version. So how did the original conference papers transform into the ultimate publication?
Well, basically, so in 2021, with the COVID having happened to all of us, me and Joachim, we sat down online as well as we are today, and we discussed how COVID had impacted Jewish life across both the world and Europe. And we realized, as together with all Jews who lived through COVID, that how to practice Judaism and how to be Jewish really quite drastically changed. And they had to bring in virtual realities, virtual spaces to be able to practice their Jewish identities. And in line with this, or alongside this, there has also been this development, continued development since the 1990s of memory institutions and heritage sites linked to Jewish history, something that Ruth Ellen Gruber has called virtual Jewishness, and we will discuss this later, I'm sure. And both of these developments are sort of held together by the idea of virtuality. So in 2021, as we were sitting down, me and Joachim, we thought, what does virtuality now actually means, having had this experience of COVID? What are digitized spaces and how do they feed in how the Jewish past has been thought about and being reconstructed and used for different purposes since the Holocaust? So that was sort of the foundation for why we wanted a conference in the first place, which ended up later on being this book.
And I think we still had a very optimistic outlook thing. I mean, there were all kinds of hindrances and problems produced by the pandemic and the reactions to it. But we could see how resilient many of these communities are, offering synagogue services online, publishing now in different ways, meeting. Suddenly we had more listeners to our seminar papers than ever before, because people came in from outside, from all over the world, and didn't have to come to Southampton or Gothenburg. But then obviously, I think in relation to your question, October 7 happened, the attacks by Hamas and the responses, and the ensuing Gaza war, and a rise in new forms of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel activities that somehow strengthened, in a way, the argument. We need more of this togetherness on a virtual level as well, but at the same time, of course, put everything a bit in question as well, that we were so optimistic about during the conference. And this has surely had an impact on how the papers develop into chapters of the book finally.
Yeah, I mean, we can see from the final papers that when we compare them to what they looked like originally, they had to add, of course, more data. And this new data brought sometimes quite different conclusions to what Jewish and non-Jewish interactions or co-construction were like in these kind of spaces. And essays that are included in this book that talk about that originally really focused on the possibilities of virtual spaces had to also include how to understand this as the current situation really intensified and heightened all of the challenges that come with virtual spaces.
So it obviously had a great deal of effects in the broader world, in the academic world and in virtual spaces. It was quite profound, really. But it wasn't just an episode. The new ways that people interacted, or the more intense ways that people interacted online, have certainly persisted. In the Jewish context, has this digital world or this virtual world of Jewishness become more profoundly connected as a result of COVID?
Yes, certainly. Again, there are two sides to it. On the one hand, these options that virtuality is in the digital world offers has broadened in many ways, audiences, aspects, internationality. But at the same time, it has maybe created smaller spaces of reclusion, spaces of retreat, where you maybe feel more secure. And of course, that's a shame when you don't feel secure in going out onto the agora or the marketplace and present your ideas and exchange them with others. So it's a very double-sided thing, which really is reflected, I think, in the book.
Yeah, the different book chapters in the book, some of them really bring up, as Joachim said, all of these positive effects of the digital worlds that, especially during COVID, but also since October 7th, that bring different groups together where they can meet up, try to understand each other, even construct ways of moving forward together and to coexist and even belong to the same world together. But then on the other hand, we also see the opposite taking place. So again, it seems to be a sort of intensification of what's happening in Jewish spaces in real life, but also then in the digital world.
Dr. Hultman, you were talking about these concepts of Jewish faces, virtually Jewish, in your first answer. And so your book opens with keynotes from Ruth Ellen Gruber and Diana Pinto, that they first introduced these ideas decades ago on being virtually Jewish and Jewish spaces. Since their introduction to these ideas, especially once digitization became a norm or a new norm in people's lived experiences, how do you think these ideas have shifted?
Well, I could start, and go 30 years back, because I have met Diana Pinto and Ruth Ellen Gruber at the time. I remember mid-1990s, shortly after the fall of the wall, Europe is reopened in a certain way, particularly in Eastern Europe. Jewish culture is being rediscovered as an indispensable part of the history of all those countries, particularly Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, then Ukraine as well. People started traveling, rediscovering synagogue buildings, rearranging things, creating new communities. At the same time, there was a new, Holocaust awareness, in the sense that new memorials were created, memorials also as kind of research places, international meeting places. So a lot of things going on that evoked a great optimism among some of the observers. And Diana Pinto, who has worked in a European context and with minorities and minority languages, regarded this as a twofold chance, one for the Jewish communities within Europe to awaken from the isolation or marginality, particularly in Eastern Europe. At the same time, we saw positive developments in the Middle East, the Oslo peace process, with Israel under Rabin ready to admit that the occupation of the occupied territories is wrong and needs to be fixed, and a state of Palestine needs somehow to be created. And also the churches somehow, particularly the Catholic Church at the time, the Pope visited a synagogue in Rome. So that there was an overall feeling things are in movement and things are changing into a positive direction. As Diana Pinto, during one of our many walks we made, particularly in Berlin, looked at this empty space of Potsdamer Platz and said, this is the biggest hole in Europe, the biggest building site in Europe, and it could be an image for the big task before us to create a new Europe that overcomes former borders, and a Europe in which Jews play an important role, where people realize that Jewish culture and Jewish history is an indispensable part of European culture and history, and that Holocaust awareness and Holocaust memory and education is not just a Jewish thing, but something that's important for the whole of Europe. Ruth Ellen Gruber, in her work, added, because she was traveling a lot, and she created guidebooks for American Jews who came to Eastern Europe, searching for traces of their ancestors and their families. And she realized that new forms of Jewish life, including klezmer music and things like that, were created not only within those communities, those Jewish communities, but by non-Jews as well. This was her idea of a kind of virtual Jewishness, a Jewishness that's not produced only by Jews, but in a Jewish, non-Jewish dialogue, maybe for a bridge time until there would be more communities growing again. So her book was not a criticism of non-Jews playing klezmer music. It was rather an analysis of a very lively and interesting situation shortly after the fall of the wall, where virtuality came in as a kind of new quality. Just to give you the background, this is why we invited those two to reflect about the optimism of 30 or 25 years ago and give us a new assessment of what, in their view, the situation looks like today.
Yeah, and especially Diana Pinto, in her chapter in this book, is really a lot more cautious when it comes to how to understand Jewish spaces and their role and presence in Europe today, especially since societies, the European societies, are now different today. They are not as enthusiastic about pluralism and liberalism, perhaps, but we have seen the rise of populism and right-wing governments and terror attacks. And among all of these differences, arising in Europe today, then the question is, what role will Jewish spaces play here? And do they actually still have a role or not? And this is where Diana Pinto is more cautious and sort of sees today, in our society today, as a crossroad. Perhaps Jewish spaces will be able to mobilize and continue to be really vital educational spaces for Jews and non-Jews to learn about themselves and each other, but perhaps they will not be anymore, depending on what happens.
Talking about the core philosophy of the book and this contrast between the optimism and, I don't want to say necessarily pessimism, but realist assessment. The book refers to this new polycrisis of rising antisemitism. And we could also see, the general shift around the world towards right-wing governments in some places as part of a shift to exclusionary ideas. Although recently in the Hungarian context, there might arguably be a shift away from that. Contrasting this with the hopefulness that Gruber and Pinto had in virtuality and co-created Jewish spaces. Do you think this is a more pessimistic future we've emerged into? Or do you feel that the chapters reveal new ways that Jewish spaces can still function as positives amid crisis?
Among all the things we have said now, what the present looks like, the book gives quite a positive view of the future and of virtual spaces, both in digital forms and as public processes. Of course, it's a complicated picture that it gives, but it does provoke ideas that digital spaces, particularly perhaps, really offer up areas where Jews and non-Jews can really meet up and interact and not only have a dialogue, but then also combine it and create themselves in relation to each other, which is really what Jewish spaces and co-construction is all about. But we also see in some case studies that Jewish history and Israel are now really convoluted. When you talk about spaces linked to the Jewish past, they are now linked to Israel and what's going on in that geopolitical conflict. And that creates, of course, a lot of challenges for Jewish spaces in Europe today.
And unfortunately, the world is not so easy, black and white. You can't say right-wing government or right-wing populism is anti-Semitic and left-wing is democratic and good and nice. We see a lot of anti-Semitism on the left. We see a lot of that convolution of Jews in Europe with Israel. Jews are being made responsible for what the Israeli government does. People feel pro-Palestinian but attack a synagogue or even ambulance cars in London that belong to a Jewish community. Hungary is an interesting example. Jews had a relatively good life under Orban, I think you could say. So we need to bring this aspect of Jewish, non-Jewish spaces together with other forms of democratic involvement and democratic exchange. And in the Ana Pinto spirit, Jews cannot live securely in a society when other minorities are endangered or suppressed or whatever. So I'm very happy, obviously, about the outcome of the elections in Hungary and partly also in Poland. We have Australia and Canada as well. So there are overlapping trends in all directions, but maybe we have focused a bit too much in recent years, since these mid-90s, on the Jewish, non-Jewish situation, and should now bring it in dialogue with other important aspects of development of democratic societies within Europe.
That's a very important point, actually, to not emphasize one dialogue too much, because you can easily create a doom and gloom or even a hopeless optimism from that. And this is something I think the book touches on very well, where Jewish spaces are described as agoras. So we can look at the material and cultural dynamics of Jews and non-Jews, creating meaningful encounters within these spaces. So in Europe now, is this still a real possibility? Or have such spaces moved onto the razor's edge, to quote the book, of Jewish and non-Jewish political controversies?
Again, it gives two sides to the story. It gives really, and we have example of social media being used for really demonstrating different Jewish kinds of identities in Poland and Ukraine, and how people really engage with it, both from a perspective of, the fascination of the other, but also from a perspective of acceptance and respect for the other as well. And we have other examples of Jewish and Muslim dialogues in digital spaces linked to Berlin, where we also have seen that those dialogues, although they've been really difficult, both during COVID, but perhaps especially after October 7th, people participating in these dialogues have really been able to see each other with empathy and even arrive as a sort of hope for the future of living together. So I do think that there is a real possibility that these spaces can be used as agoras, as spaces where different groups can meet up and learn about each other and teach each other about each other and grow themselves from these spaces. But we also have other examples where particularly physical spaces really are, I guess you could call them sticky with memory, and how when this geopolitical situation we have in Israel and in the Middle East, when this happens, these physical sites, say signs, a Hebrew sign in Vienna or museum in Stockholm, they really become sites where people are engaging from a space of anti-Semitism. So we have examples of both things going on at the same time.
Yeah, and those sites need to be protected. There's police outside now. There's always a kind of feeling, can I really go there? This is why partly activities have been transformed into virtual forms. And I still think this Agora thing or the open market place where cultures can meet, where languages can meet, where even things that are often thought of as banal or ridiculous, like food or music, but they are areas of possible meeting. But it takes place in the internet, which taken all together and our experiences with it in the past, 20 years, it's not just a nice place. It's a place of anger and resentment and people shouting at each other. So very different kind of marketplace. Again, as Maja said, both developments are there. But I would still say that there's a lot going on in terms of dialogue, teaching, education, that has really new quality now because the virtual world has developed and it has become better and more professional. Also in Jewish studies, say, mapping, for example, has become so detailed and so good and so interesting, and you can do it from, anywhere. Imaginary travels and all this kind of thing, in-depth studies about synagogues and cemeteries, for example, in Stockholm, as Maja did in her own PhD. Technically, and also in terms of content, I think we're much better than anything we had 20 years ago.
It's much easier to vicariously live online now as well. It's actually just observing this today during my break with people's interactions with the digital world. And it reminds me, in the introduction, Umberto Eco is quoted in his idea of the hyperreal in his essay in which he talked about one day this unreal world will be as real as the physical space. So you're dividing your discussion, obviously, between these digital spaces, virtual spaces, and physical spaces. But at what point does this virtual world become the physical space, in effect, because of human interactions with it?
A very theoretical question, which I enjoy. So thank you very much for that. I think what we do see from the examples of the case studies in the book is that while perhaps we cannot see or understand the digital space as a sort of physical reality or as the same thing as a physical reality, we do see it overlap with events, practices taking place in the physical reality or physical space, however we would like to phrase that. And so this virtualness or living in the virtual world or being in the virtual world is always connected in that sense to the physical, to what's happening in the physical scene or in the physical setting. Great example of that from the book is Susanne Korbel's study of a Hebrew sign being put up on a street in Vienna, which a digital community really asked for. Like, we really want this to be put up in the space and to stay there. And after all of this digital community emphasized it and talked about it and gathered people to talk about it even more, it also became a reality where it could stay in the street and become a physical space where people interact with the Jewish past. So perhaps that's a sort of the angle we take when we talk about virtuality, that we don't see it as the same thing, but it is interlinked with the physical reality.
And I think this has been there before the internet and all that, through literature and memoir. I remember traveling with a group in Ukraine, and we had the books by Manis Berber, a very important intellectual who left the Communist Party, was persecuted by the Nazis, and found himself in between all ideological lines in the 1930s, and sat down to write his memoirs. And remembered the Städtel, the little Jewish town where his family came from. And in his memoir, it was 90% Jewish, and everybody was praying all day and living a life according to Jewish law. And in reality, if that is the right word, when you study the place, you find out it's only 50% Jewish. Jews were very mixed, from Zionists to very left-wing radical Bundists to, all kinds of orthodoxy and Hasidism, so much more diverse than he remembered it in his memoir. And the big question then was, what is the real Sablotov? Is it the one from the statistics and the archives? Or is it the beautiful picture that somebody who had to leave the place took along with him? Is there more connected to a space than just a house or a street, but also the feeling that I can walk freely through this street? Yeah, so I think this interplay between so-called reality what we see, what we can measure with statistics, and virtuality, what we dream of, what we remember, what we describe in literature or in music or in the arts, has already been there. And I think we just have to accept that both are valid. Not use the word true, because that's different, but valid as sources in any case. And that is added, if I may add that, by the options the internet offers. For example, this mapping project of Maja by Hultman has many layers. But you create a map of a space and give it its Jewish past. There was the synagogue, there was the cemetery, there was the mikveh, there was the path the Jews went when they went to the marketplace, and so on. You reproduce it in conjunction or in collaboration with Polish group, but suddenly within the Polish group, there's a feeling, oh my God, that's a lot of Jews in this village. Can this really be true? Has this house also been Jewish? Will they come back and take it away from us? So this adds another layer, and suddenly the space is a different one if you look at it from America or from Poland. I guess we just have to accept these different layers.
These aren't really new things. They're just operating in a new way. Culture is always going to divest itself throughout different mediums. And this digitization is just a new way that we're using, really, to kind of, let's say, create the same feelings of memory and space and those kinds of things. I'd like to ask a question now that's a little bit more structural. As the editors of this book, what influenced your decision-making when creating the core structure of digital practices, heritage, and public spaces? How did you see the sections being in dialogue with one another?
Yeah, thank you. We thought about virtuality. So that was our baseline. And we thought that, at least we discuss and argue in this book, that virtuality comes in different forms. It comes as a digital form, as a digital space. But virtuality, at least in Jewish studies, is also seen as a cultural product. Something that is virtual is a cultural product that is linked to the Jewish past. And then we also saw the virtuality as a very public process that might lead towards democracy and the visibility of minorities. And those were the three sort of themes that we structured the whole book around, to basically be able to say something about virtuality.
And heritage, of course, is the greatest industry in all that. So you have heritage travels and these mapping projects. Ruth Ellen Gruber herself has now for many years been the head of a Rothschild Foundation sponsored website, or it's much more than a website. It's a collection of every aspect of Jewish cultural heritage. A synagogue saved in Romania, a cemetery cleared up somewhere in Slovakia, people traveling and writing reports about it. No single person can keep all these things in mind that happen, but the website offers a glimpse and an insight into those many activities. This is why heritage just needed to be there, because there are so many projects.
So given what you've just said on the structure then, digital practices, heritage, public spaces, I'd like to talk about these in more detail. So considering the chapters in part 2, which are digital tools, social media, Jewish-Muslim encounters, what do you feel the book shows us about how online environments may bridge and hinder Jewish, non-Jewish relations in a time of crisis?
I think this part of the book really shows the huge possibilities of the digital world and how it allows for not only interactions, but really in-depth dialogues and a co-constructed culture as well. But we also see, especially in the contribution by Dekel Peretz, that for a digital space to have this quality, it depends on actors and the actors running it. So it all comes down to who sets up these spaces and who control them, and what is the goal that they are having for these spaces. Where his conclusion is that if it is controlled and carefully organized towards a purpose where it is that we want different ethnic or religious groups to meet each other and to really understand each other, then the space can become a shared project towards dialogue and understanding for each other. So it's interesting to see when we talk about the digital fora, we are talking about that they are curated, and the question is always about by whom and for what purpose.
maybe add that it's about Jewish-Muslim dialogue in that paper by Pellets. And of course, all these forms of dialogue have to compete with all the other things on offer in the internet. But I think curated is really the right word when it's done well. The same goes for, say, visits to former concentration camps or memorial sites. If they're not prepared well and if they're not curated and controlled in the same sense, then people are really questioning the efficiency or the use of such visits. It's not just a go there once and you'll be an anti-Nazi for the rest of your life. No, it's a constant education, a constant engagement with it. Where the digital world offers a lot, obviously, in tools. So I would also say that this part is full of good and lively examples. This new virtuality seems to be quite helpful.
The standard of engagement that people had in the past before the digital age was less, and now it tends to be more. Well, we would hope so. In some cases, it perhaps isn't, right? But so a simple trip to a heritage site, a famous historical site, or a site of great tragedy like a concentration camp or so on, is being supplemented by this digital interaction. And you've already said, Dr. Schlör, that you feel that is effective. Do you think it is generally effective, or is it sometimes counterproductive?
It can surely be counterproductive as well. But also real visits in real places can be counterproductive. At the moment, we see how many different groups try to use your ghost memorial sites to promote their own political agenda. Then the digital world is not free of that danger, certainly. But neither is reality, or the real place, the so-called real place.
That's very true, yeah. I mean, it's a kind of a heterotopia, if you will. Like the site is a recreation of the site itself, and thus the memory is reinvented or reimagined.
And often they can go together. You can have a real visit in a memorial site, but an app on your phone or your tablet that shows you how the place looked like 80 years before, or from different perspectives or whatever. So I think you certainly can combine the two.
This brings me to my next point on nostalgia networks and so on, which is the part 3, which is on heritage in the book. And it's a wide range of topics in this section, like nostalgia networks among American Jews, which you've already mentioned in an earlier answer, to doubly foreign cemeteries in Poland and the tangible and intangible medieval Jewish worlds of spire worms and mains. Do you feel these contributions reframe heritage as a form of virtuality, such as through mnemonic practice, that has grounded European Jewish life today?
It suggests it. That's how I would view these contributions. We have really engaging essays by Susanne Urban and Lippe Langsne, who talk about museum and virtual reality construction as enabling a revitalization of Jewish culture of the past or linked to the past, and how they might even empower and comfort people, Jews and non-Jews today. So in that way, absolutely, virtuality can be seen as something that is really positioning European Jewish life as linked to Europe and grounded in Europe as a geographical area. And Magdalena Abraham Diefenbach, she also gives a thorough methodological and discussion on how our documentation of Jewish cemeteries in Europe today, how we might be able to help them survive after, I don't know how many years, but they will inevitably at some point not be there anymore in the physical reality, in the physical world that we are in, because time will erode them, and how the digital world can really then function as a way of continuing the presence of the Jewish past in some way.
And in that case, I think a very interesting aspect that it's set in Poland, but in a part that used to belong to Germany. So it carries German culture, German language, German inscriptions, and so on. And studying the cemetery together, for example, with a German-Polish group, adds another dimension to an awareness of those young Poles. Oh, this place has been German before. It has a kind of German heritage. That's not something very easy to live with, maybe for them, but it's something that can enrich their perspective, since they live in such a European border region where the border has been opened 35 something years ago, 37, but now it's partly closed again because of political reasons. Studying history in really on the ground by studying inscriptions on a cemetery not only tells you something about the presence of Jews, but also about the cultural exchange and linguistic exchange in that border region, helped again by digital instruments.
That actual chapter in particular really enhances our understanding of how dynamic identity and history is when it interacts in these places. Okay, so on to part 4, which is public spaces, which, of course, we've talked about those in the earlier responses. Jewish spaces in present Vienna, Jewish spaces in contemporary Stockholm, and reflections on shrinking spaces and personal realities are all discussed in this part. These chapters deal with physical and virtual realities in the context of public spaces. Given this publicness, has the visible Jewish presence in European cities become more fragile since today, or has it become an essential presence for democratic life?
It certainly has become an essential part of the self-understanding of large parts, say, of both my examples, German and Polish societies. I did my civil service in Poland in 1980, when there was still the socialist regime in crisis, and then the strikes and protests started in Danzig, near which I was working in one of those memorials, obviously. And the question for us was, for example, can we as Germans interfere with what happens in Poland, or should we just look at the memorial site as a part of German crimes committed on Polish soil? Are we allowed to voice an opinion about the Polish resistance movement against communism? I found that fascinating. It was a really important part of my education in a way. And I met people. Stanisław Krajewski, who took part at the conference, is one of those who learned that studying Jewish history and the Jewish history of spaces, what happened to an old synagogue, what happened to the cemetery, was part of a kind of resistance against the communist government and against the Polish narrative of victimhood at the same time. So our history is much more complex, and we need to study this in order to understand ourselves. And today, you have this all over Poland. You have so many initiatives that document Jewish life in Poland. You have a lot of controversies, obviously, historiographical controversies, this is maybe not the place to talk about, but they are necessary in my view. And the same is true in Germany. You have these little memoirs, Stolpersteine, that show where people have lived in a certain street, in a certain house before they were deported by the Nazis. From those small Stolpersteine monuments that commemorate individuals and families to the large memorial near Brandenburg Gate, and every German city has invited former Jewish inhabitants who managed to emigrate for a visit, has written the history of the city that includes now a Jewish perspective, and all this spread into many other countries. Over the last year, it is under question, it is partly under attack, but I think even if the stones vanish one day, although they tend to remain for a long time if they're not willfully destroyed, digital practices and virtual approaches can really help us to strengthen this and to continue it. But it's fragile at the same time. Of course, as I said, we have police standing in front of every synagogue, school and kindergarten. We have people here in Berlin in recent years with all these so-called pro-Palestinian or rather pro-Hamas demonstrations who don't carry a kippah on the head or a Star of David as a jewelry and try not to show publicly their Jewishness. That's, of course, something nobody would have thought would happen ever again in Germany.
Yeah, and I think what you really points at here in connection to this section of the book, Joachim, is that physical sites linked to Jewish life or the Jewish past are really invite for discussions to society and society members to really ask themselves, who do we think we are and who are included in this idea that we have of ourselves and our identities and who should belong to this space and not. And this is why we really wanted to focus on the public spaces as well, to really engage with those sort of discussions, where we see, for example, in the contribution by Marcela Menachem Zoufala, that when she organized the conference of the European Association for Israel Studies in Prague in 2024, so really just after October 7th and during the war, the beginnings of the war, they were given such heavy security they couldn't even have a digital visibility because people weren't sure how this conference would be treated by people outside of it. But within the conference itself, which actually was able to take place and nothing thankfully happened, but people really engaged in discussions and really created a space where they could understand each other and meet each other, again, with the word empathy. And on the other hand, one of the other contributions written by myself and Karin Brigger, we look at museums and cultural organizations in Stockholm linked to Jewish history. And after October 7th, they have really struggled in how to engage with the idea of democracy. To live in a democratic society and to be a museum or a cultural event, hopefully inviting every kind of person who lives in a society, does it mean that they could take a stand and take a side in the geopolitical crisis we're in? Or does it mean that they should avoid that in total? And what does every people who feel connected to the museum or the cultural event or go to it, what do they think that these museums and what these spaces, what they should do? Where people living and working in these spaces really struggle on how to navigate this very polarized political landscape they are now bound to.
You mentioned museums, because that's very much my thing. It's a very interesting chapter. On that point of museums, I have lost count of the amount of articles or editorial bits that I've read where a museum specialist has said, how do we make museums relevant? My issue with that is if you have to ask the question, you're already fighting the battle in the wrong direction. But so I want to redirect that question in the Jewish context here. How do we make Jewish museums relevant?
And I think this is where Diana Pinto and Ruth Ellen Gruber in the 1990s, they were already discussing why are these spaces relevant, where Diana Pinto really pointed towards these spaces enabling, well, both being a part of, but also enabling pluralist societies where the other in any kind of form can really exist next to what the majority population understand themselves to be, right? And this is also why we really focus on the concept of virtuality, because for space to really be virtual, it is about co-constructing something, right? It's about being relational to whatever is not exactly what you are like. And we see this in the volume taking place.
I think the Jewish Museum in Berlin is a good example. It's relatively new. I mean, it goes back to one that was formed in January 1933, a week before Hitler came to power, and then obviously acted like a kind of ghetto thing for a couple of years. It was closed in 1938, and it took until 1999, 2000 until a new Jewish museum was built. And I think it would have been wrong from the start to create another island situation where the minority looks at itself and people are invited to look at this very interesting minority, but it rather really functions as a marketplace. It invites the whole city. It has events and discussions that go way beyond only Jewish history and reflects in that sense the Jewish history of Berlin. There never was a ghetto, really. There never was a Jewish quarter. But we see different levels of activity and contribution, as the word used to be, of Jews to the growth and the intensity of life, particularly in 1920s Berlin, obviously in all kinds of aspects. That's not something you can reduce to one or two places. You have symbolic places like the old synagogue, which is the so-called Neue Synagoge, but it's from 1866, with its very symbolic golden cupola. But what Peter Gay has termed the Jewish spirit of Berlin is something that has to be found all over the city, reflected by the whole city, its literature, its music, its theater scenes, and not just one place. And of course, in that sense, again, virtuality is a very helpful instrument when all goes well.
So in your discussion with this Berlin museum, then it's a conscious effort to avoid a conscious self-orientalization, if you will, and instead do something more open, which brings us to a really important and interesting point discussed throughout the book, which is the idea of co-creation in spaces. What details of the book tells us the most about this co-creation between Jews and non-Jews in these spaces?
I think they really shows that co-constructive practices are, despite the polar crisis that we're in, it's really taking place all the time, and people really engage in them and find them important for understanding themselves and to navigating current, own personal journeys, but also the current political climate. And I think especially in today's climate, which is quite polarized in terms of politics, the idea of co-constructing something which demands, empathy for the other or accepting difference, it would seem as that will be a really important process to really facilitate, which is why museums, to go back to your last question, why museums then are really relevant for any kind of heritage space or a Jewish space, because these are the spaces that can make sure that such kind of encounters and interactions take place. Yeah, but I guess it's also a question of what's the hen and what's the egg. Does co-construction come from going into Jewish space, or do people go to Jewish spaces because they are already willing to co-construct something and to build their own self-understanding together with other types of identities? This is probably a question that will go on for generations, I guess, in the future. We don't give a definite answer on that in the book.
Co-construction is more than just the majority allowing the minority to build something or whatever, but that you as a non-Jew feel responsible for the fact that the synagogue is an indispensable part of the cultural and religious landscape of your own city, as maybe is the mosque, as surely is the church, and as very interestingly is the intercultural exchange between all of them. Only then will it be a co-constructed space. It's not just about allowing the minority to have its own little island, but to accept that as part of everybody's city. And that's so difficult today. I mean, we see it in Jewish studies where Jewish students at German and other European universities, Britain, for example, don't really feel very secure at the moment, or they feel they're not really protected. On the other hand, right-wing populists instrumentalize Jewish culture as a kind of whatever propaganda tool against Islam in general. So it's a very delicate situation, particularly I think at universities at the time, but still we go on teaching, of course, and teach not in the sense of an island, but mostly teaching non-Jews about what Judaism is and what you can learn from and about it. But particularly in the universities, it's a very fragile situation at the moment, I would say.
I think so too. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But I think the book does a really good job of just showing how dynamic the interactions are. It's not just here's a few episodes of Jewish life in Europe. There's a constant interconnection throughout that of these ideas of shared spaces, shared experiences, as well as marginal places and so on. And we've touched on these ideas quite extensively throughout, but I'd just like to see if you coalesce into a statement regarding the epilogue. So you both raise a very interesting idea, which is the reinvention of Jewish spaces and culture in Europe through virtuality. What do you think this reinvention looks like now? And what do you think it will look like a decade from now?
What I think is really useful in this book is that in choosing to engage with these questions from the point of view of virtuality, we are really, and all contributions are really striving to find moments of democracy, maybe we can say that, or at least co-construction or meeting each other and co-creating ourselves in relation to others, and which is an idea very much built on hope. And the idea that, we can interact with each other and carry the burdens of the past while challenging current problems as well, which the book is really a few great examples of where this is actually taking place. What really struck me during this process of making this book is how the contributions really show that so many people involved in these virtual spaces are so mindful and so attentive on trying to create these kind of spaces, and they really want to be vulnerable and meet each other and trying to engage with others. So in that sense, I think the reinvention perhaps isn't that a new space will pop up and it'll be completely different, but perhaps especially in midst of the crisis that Jewish European life, but also Jewish studies, the Middle Eastern context that we're in, that virtuality can also offer that kind of hope to the situation.
I thought a lot about that specific question. I thought I go back to my own work and back to the notion of the archive. Digital instruments have helped us a lot to rediscover sources, to bring sources together from different archives that have been dispersed by the political and historical events, because archives have been robbed and things brought elsewhere, archives have been destroyed and whatever. And this kind of reconstruction where the digital really helps us a lot, I think helps us also to regard that Jewish space within Europe as a very diverse thing. So we have often studied Jewish history from ideological perspectives, either Zionist, all this assimilation was nonsense, we need to create our own state and build up the state of Israel and forget about all the diaspora, or from a lacrimose perspective, say all that history just leads into the Holocaust, all these societies are anti-Semitic and there's nothing beautiful about Jewish history, but Auschwitz is the final end of it. Both are difficult, and it's more complex, and it's more difficult to understand, and it's more diverse, and you dig into the sources and take a new look at Worms and Speyer and Mainz, which have been huge and important medieval Jewish communities. With the help of new sources and the help of the digital world, you see them in a new light, even those of so long ago. And the same goes for the 19th century, or maybe the 1920s and early 1930s, in order to understand the situation of Jews in Germany, who found themselves before the decision, shall I leave or shall I send my children away? How will I arrange my emigration? Where the hell is Uruguay? And all these questions can now be dealt with in a more complex, not complete, but nearing that in a more complete way. And that's certainly progress.
So I've read the book about 1.5 times now, actually. And I really liked it. And I'm already thinking of ways that I might incorporate certain parts of it into teaching future courses and so on. I think there's some really nice examples. They're certainly outside of the cultural context of where I teach, but I think that makes them more interesting. And I'm very interested in your perspective on evaluating the book, as I've already hinted at. I feel it has such incredible reach and value for students of heritage, Jewish culture, cross-cultural contact and negotiation. Given this, what are the ideas intellectually and emotionally that you'd like readers to take from the book?
I think what I've started to think a lot more about while we worked on this book, and now when it's finally out, is to question myself, and this is maybe what I would like students to do also when they read this, to question themselves, how are they placing themselves in spaces or in situations where engagement can continue with whatever is different from themselves. So what I'm thinking about while rereading some of the contributions in this book is, do I continue to all the time try to allow people from different ethnic, religious, social, whatever backgrounds, or from different political affiliation to say that, to exist in my world? Am I meeting that with empathy? Do I try to understand? And I think that is what this really book, its core in a sense, that I would love students to take with them.
No, nothing to add. I think that's really a fantastic response. Yeah.
If I could add, actually, I agree with all of that. And I have a bias, obviously, from an anthropological perspective, which is that I really feel readers can get a lot out of this in terms of understanding how culture really operates, right? Not as a fixed line, not as a static, as a dead thing, but something that is always engaged in creation and originality and means of survival and interpretation. I think the book that does that very well.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. That's a great way of selling the book.
So I just have one question for you then. What was the most surprising thing in editing and producing the book? And what gives you optimism for the future of Jewish life in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I was actually, perhaps that is coming out of COVID and then entering post October 7th. I was really surprised by all the positive examples of practices taking place in digital spaces. I really thought that we would have we do have a complex picture in the book, but I really thought it would be much more negative and really show the negative sides of it. And of course that exists, as we have talked about, and how Jews really perhaps, because public spaces can become really threatening right now, maybe they do meet more in virtual spaces and therefore they feel more safe. But there's also a lot of positive examples of different groups meeting up and sharing life together in digital spaces. I was really surprised and happy about that.
I mean, the bad surprise of politics in recent years was how much antisemitism is still around and what hardly really anti-Semitic images people have of Israel. The good surprise, the positive surprise concerning the conference and the book and meeting all those people and learning about the project is really how many different ways there are to develop that resilience and openness and creativity, and how much really, especially in terms of creativity, the digital world has to offer. Virtuality in its many senses has to offer. That was a positive surprise.
Dr. Hultman, Dr. Schlör, thank you so much for your time today. This brings us to the end of today's conversation. Your insights help us frame heritage as not just about preserving buildings or documents, but about keeping living connections between people, places, and memory alive.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Really, thank you for moderating and for those interesting questions.
Whether you're a scholar, a traveler, a museum professional, or curious about cultural endurance, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Keep exploring Jewish heritage sites, intangible and tangible, and do check out the book on De Gruyter Brill's website. It's virtual and real-life spaces of Jewish Europe in the 21st century. If you found this episode interesting and would like us to explore Jewish spaces in future episodes, write to us at podcast@brill.com. If enough of you write to us about a specific topic, we'll take it up in a future episode. Thanks for joining us. Keep asking what gives places life and how we engage with them. It was a pleasure being your host for today. I'm Dr. Sean Rollins. Thank you and goodbye.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by De Gruyter Brill.